Stuart, why don't you come on up? So Stuart is an analyst at large, minister without portfolio at VentureBeat, which reminds me, let's come and sit down here for a second. It reminds me of a time when, you're going to get there, go for it.
Yeah.
The time when I was, I worked at Accel Partners and they offered me the job of entrepreneur in residence. My godfather said I should absolutely not take that job.
It's a good job title.
Well, yeah, it's good or maybe a little pretentious, but
Yeah, analyst at large gives me the opportunity to basically do pretty much whatever I like, which is fun.
Good. So, so what I wanted to do before we get into this kind of weaving together of these different threads into the path forward, is for you to tell me how you've been, what you've been spending your time on, at large, in the round, and where does this fit within your view of, this world that we're all involved in, and then how you're going to kind of focus us down on the next.
Yeah, for sure. So around about 5 years ago, I started analyzing the marketing technology landscape. Myself and a few other illuminaries, they're certainly illuminaries, I'm not. We were looking at the entire landscape, and at that time, there were maybe less than 1,000 products on the market that mattered. And now there's well over 7,000 products on the market that matter. Mm-hmm. And in 5 years, that's phenomenal growth.
Do we know what the number is off the top of your head for numbers of tokens or blockchain projects?
Blockchain projects is currently, well, in terms of cryptocurrencies, there's well over 350 recognized cryptocurrencies, and it'll be 1,000 before we even blink.
Yep.
There's plenty more that don't even matter.
Yeah.
But those are the ones that matter. Within that journey, we started seeing AI appear an awful lot in the marketing technology space, and then we started seeing blockchain appear. Mm-hmm. So I was looking at and analyzing blockchain from as far back as 3 or 4 years ago, which in blockchain years is 40 or 50. Yeah. Where we are now is in a very interesting place, because when we look at the numbers of people that are involved in or are investing in or are using anything that has blockchain technology underlying through it, it's a little bit like 3D TV in terms of usage. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's 0.001% of people who even care about it in the first place. So one of the things we're always musing on, and I write cryptocurrency news stories for VentureBeat, typically once a day, sometimes more. Mm-hmm. One of the things we've been musing on is how do we actually get this out of the hands of just a very few people and get it into mainstream usage. And that's something that we're going to be discussing with. Is it
feeding dragons with CryptoKitties, or is it saving trees? Or
who in the audience has a CryptoKitty? Hands up. Anyone got a CryptoKitty? Anyone would like a CryptoKitty? Because I've got one spare. You can buy it off me for just a small amount of Ethereum. I'll talk to you afterwards. You can buy my CryptoKitty off me. It's not a Steph Curry one. I'm really sorry. It is just a regular one. But I did take 2 CryptoKitties that I bought, and I bred a new one. So you can take it. It can be your forever home.
Is it house trained?
It is very house trained. But that's the thing. I mean, CryptoKitties is one of the most popular games available on Ethereum, and yet one person in this room is actually involved in it, unless you're all lying and not putting your hands up because you're too tired, right? Who hasn't had coffee in the last 2 hours? There we go.
We're leaving the door open for a little bit to circulate a little bit of fresh air. You might resuscitate the crowd that way. It's beginning.
So that's the general problem right there with what's going on in blockchain.
Yeah.
We mentioned an actual app that's real, that exists right now, that you can log into, that you can play, and you can spend money on it, and nobody is using it.
To its knees.
Yeah, nobody's using it.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest issue right now.
And so when the biggest issue there, therefore, is things that people actually want to use to solve real problems.
Right.
Or to fulfill a need to have a collectible, or
Well, this is the biggest problem with startup land in general. I mean, if you've ever spent any time in Silicon Valley or any of the other big ecosystems around the world, what you see time and time and time again is startups that should not exist in the first place because they're solving a problem that doesn't need to be solved. Even worse than that, startups that produce a $400 product that solves a problem that could be solved with a paperclip. Juicero, anybody? That would be one example. Thank you for the laugh, sir. These things happen all the time in startup land, and it's no wonder that we still have fewer than 5% of startups actually make it beyond the first year because they're trying to solve problems that don't exist. We're seeing exactly the same thing in blockchain.
Especially with an abundance of capital.
Especially. Yeah. In fact, that's making everything worse because the abundance of capital in blockchain means that everybody that is involved in providing services to help you launch your blockchain product or service on the world is charging a fortune for them because they know that they can get the money from you.
Yeah.
And so actually the ecosystem is very unhealthy right now because everything's too expensive.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you see that normalize pretty rapidly, and then we'll be left with a number of projects that are pretty well capitalized. And therefore, if they're run by or coordinated by a sophisticated community, then they will, hunker down and keep trying to find out which problems are really worth solving and the way to do it. We had a panel earlier about scalability, which means I think in the next few years, we maybe need that time to ensure that the networks are going to be able to scale for when the applications do, in fact, take off. Good. So I'm going to double check how we're doing on our panelists. We have I think we look in good shape.
Yep. They're a good-looking group, actually.
They're a fantastic-looking group.
Yeah. They're very photogenic, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. So if you want to share pictures of the panel on Twitter, if you'd like to increase Snapchat's share price, do go ahead and use it. That would be interesting.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, sir.
So I'll slide over here.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think we're a bit old for Snapchat.
Super.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us on this wonderful, wonderful afternoon. It's incredibly hot outside, which means it's incredibly hot in here. So we have been keeping the doors open. Hopefully everyone's going to stay nice and cool now. I'm the kind of moderator that likes to ask guests to introduce themselves. And more importantly, why is the topic of going from where we are now to mainstream important to you? So maybe if we can go down the line, say who you are, who you work for, and why this is an important topic for you.
Coming out. Great. So I'm Brennan, Carley. I work for Thomson Reuters. Long and checkered past in financial services, trading companies, network and telecommunications, internet, and so forth. Done a couple of startups, and actually a lot of my experience is around transition from early stage startup kind of businesses to more mature adult, if you will, kind of businesses.
Excellent.
Hi, Brad. My name is Loretta Joseph. I'm the advisory chair of the Australian Digital Chamber of Commerce. I'm the Fintech and regulatory advisor to the Bermudian government, the Mauritian government. I'm the advisory chair, I think, of 5 different associations of blockchain around the world. I helped write the first self-regulation of Bitcoin in Australia in 2012. I've worked very closely with governments and regulators and central banks in the last 5 years trying to figure out how this technology actually does impact us. It's important to me because I was a derivatives trader. I've been regulated in 30 markets. I think in this new ecosystem, the world of no regulation is bad, but I think the world of over-regulation is even worse.
Excellent, thank you.
My name's Neil Pennington. I have 3 interests in this space. One is with an alternative payments platform. Initially started for people on universal credit, who are unbanked, being able to run their lives using distributed ledger technology. The second is an application for dealing with cross-border crime for the Commonwealth using secure hardware and the Rivets token. And the third is with the Energy Web Foundation, which is a not-for-profit foundation building the open-sourced blockchain for the global energy sector. Why is it important to me? Well, I came probably about 3 years ago from the corporate world. What's interesting for me is around, to really scale, is around confidence, and it's around engaging everybody from startups to the corporate world and really making this thing work. I also have an involvement with this Mauritius stuff on the virtual currency, that kind of area, and obviously the roles of government as well in that. But certainly the startup world to the corporate world, combining and making this great technology of ours fly is my interest.
Excellent. And last but not least?
I'm Vinay Gupta. I was the project manager and I did a lot of the comms work for the Ethereum launch. Then spent some time at Consensus. My background before that is defense, security, and resilience. And I now am CEO of a company called Mattereum, which does all the nasty, complicated technical and legal work to make sure that if you put real-world assets on a chain and transfer them, courts will recognize the transfers as valid, which is fiddly. And my kind of interest in this is basically, as a species, we're screwed, right? We're trashing the planet, we're burning the resources, we're enslaving the poor. There are more slaves now than there were at any other point in human history. And if we don't find some way of fixing this, we're going to turn this planet into exactly the place that all your dystopian sci-fi have told you it's going to turn into. So there needs to be some serious cracking of the whip to raise the standards of how we treat each other globally, and that's going to come down to the ability to force people to do the right thing, even when it's in their best interests not to. So for me, this is all about the ability to build tools to enforce global rule of law, even in the inconvenient areas like things like climate change.
Excellent. We're going to talk a lot more about that as we go through this panel, because I feel like that's a really interesting part of how we get from nothing to mainstream. But let's start at the beginning, which is where all good stories start. Right now, it's fair to say that blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies, and everything else that's related to them are in the hands of very few people. We did that little litmus test beforehand, one of the most popular games going, nobody's using it, apart from me. Just a reminder, I do have a CryptoKitty for sale. Do you have one?
I can swap you.
Oh, we can swap. We have CryptoKitties, we can swap. Or we could get them and breed them. We could breed some new ones. But, that's an indicator that we really haven't got this into the hands of very many people right now. Now, is that different from any normal marketplace? Because I remember the start of mobile phones, my cousin pulling a great big car battery out in the middle of his Jaguar with a phone attached to it. It weighed 16 pounds, and now we're at one of these devices. And that's taken an awful long time to get there. Is blockchain going to take as long? Are we just in a normal marketplace? Or is there something different about it? Brennan, pick that up for us.
Yeah, so I think if you look at, mobile phone, or you look at any kind of, emergent technology like that, you've got some early adopters, right? There's a great book that was written by Jeffrey Moore, I think it was, called Crossing the Chasm, right? So you've got this challenge of how do you go from the early adopters to the mainstream market? And I won't try and recap the whole book for you, right? But one of the critical things that you've got to really do is solve real customer problems, right? Early adopters will adopt something for the fun of it, right? They'll play CryptoKitties because they're into blockchain and because they want to look at the test case. If you go back to the early days of personal computers, people bought the original Apple I, not because they had anything useful to do with it, right? But because they enjoyed playing with the technology. And it really is solving that real customer problem that you've got to go through. And I think, the jury's out, right? So, if I look at blockchain as a technology, and I'll separate blockchain from cryptocurrencies, right? Blockchain actually, I think cryptocurrency is one of those problems that blockchain actually solves, right? It is actually fit for that purpose. But if you look at blockchain fundamentally, it's really different from traditional technologies in three ways. One is, it's not mature and robust and scalable and all the other things you'd expect of any new technology. That's not a negative, that's just the reality of any early stage technology. Second is it doesn't require a single centralized administrator, right? And third, you can directly inspect the blockchain, right? So in order to find really useful use cases, you need to find a use case where there's really value in not having that single central administrator. And candidly, most of the use cases that I've seen for blockchain today, there's a business that is acting as a central utility or a central hub of some kind using the blockchain. That's not fit for purpose, right? You're from Australia, right? You look at the Australian Central Securities Depository, which they're implementing using digital asset holding. None of the banks that are using it are directly inspecting the blockchain, right? They're using an application provided by the Australian Stock Exchange to access it. It's being run by a single central administrator. They might as well be using Oracle in their own data center and they'd get the same result, right? So I think as long as it stays in those kind of use cases, it's not going to get the mainstream adoption because it's not solving real customer problems.
Loretta, we've got the first semi-dig at Australia. Do you want to come back on that?
No, I love Australia.
I won't make any comment on that because I built a a competition system to digital asset holdings, but that's for another day. It's what I think it's important to me. I mean, I'm old. I'm almost 50, and I ran banks around the world. I think we're sitting probably where we were in 1993 with the internet. Yeah, it's new technology, but I think the thing I noticed the most is I have a 13-year-old. Because of a mobile phone, she learns things very, very differently to me. When I started, I got into blockchain because I built this clearing and settlement system for equities markets in 2012 before I actually got into Bitcoin. So when I started to look at Bitcoin in 2013, every other bond trader I know in the world told me I was an idiot. And why would I look at something like a cryptocurrency that was never going to take off? The amount of central banks and governments that I've had to go into in the last 18 months is ridiculous as one person, and it's because of the social adoption. I lived in India for 10 years, and people say, it's going to take a while. Half the population in India were born after 1991 because they have a mobile phone. And I think you've seen that Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies is a point example. The speculation and the volume. I got Bitcoin at $84. When I got to 20,000 last year, that was because she started to get rapid social adoption. So I think as technologies get better, and blockchain, it's still in its infancy, but it's one thing I look at the regulation, because regulations are very slow. Technology is moving so quickly. Like from when 1993, where I think the internet was, and to today, if you look at blockchain, we're moving at rapid pace of probably 5 years in 12 months. I can't keep up with the next week what's happening in blockchain technology. So I think social adoption is really important. Is it on the uprise? Yeah, it is, and it's because you're not maybe seeing it in markets like mature markets, but you look at the emerging markets like India, Africa, where the adoption of technology is so big because you have to. I think it's going to be very interesting in the next 5 years.
I have to disagree somewhat with yourself. I think it all depends on what you mean as the use case. With anyone, if I look at it from the energy market, we're facing, in a global space, we're facing a 1.5 degrees centigrade rise in temperature if we're lucky. And the only way that we're going to deal with that from an energy perspective is to have 100% renewables at the grid edge with millions and billions of participants contributing and managing the energy market from the ground up. Okay, and the only way that we're going to do that is with intelligence at the grid edge, optimizing each position, and a blockchain that brings that together. That blockchain clearly has to have all the aspects of participation that the open public, for example, Ethereum network has, but it also has to have governance designed in, because things like energy markets and energy systems can't just run on a random basis. You have to have a number of rules that they obey in order to work. And if you look at that as the use case, and then you start to bring the right people together, and you engage with regulators, you have half a chance to make this happen. And the second thing is financial inclusion. The example for me that I'm working on, which is this distributed ledger platform for people on benefits, you have to say, how am I going to get financial inclusion? The first piece of that, yeah, you could do that. It's a couple of nodes, and it's a bit of an app, and you could say it could be just a couple of relational databases. But if you look at expanding that ecosystem such that when somebody on benefits runs their entire daily life, and I'm talking in the first world now, where they get a bus, they get a tram, they pay for the food, they pay for the rent, they pay for their energy, all of a sudden you get a massive ecosystem who can then transfer value between themselves. And you've then got a very complex system for which distributed ledger technology and blockchain really solves that. So I think it's all about how you frame and how you tackle the problem as opposed to focus on a kind of a single proof of concept, is my view.
Can I just go back on what you said? So I think you said something really very interesting there, which is in order to make this work, you've got to have the right governance around it. And I think one of the challenges that we need to get past is looking at blockchain as a technology that solves political and organizational problems, right? Technology solves technology problems. And what you articulated is for something like that to work, you need to have the right governance around it. So because you can physically have something distributed and you don't require a single central administrator, doesn't necessarily mean you solve all the organizational and governance issues around how workflows work, so for example, if I take the social benefits, right? When you take a bus, when you take a tube, whatever, right? Somebody needs to define what it means to take a bus. right? And what is the workflow and the protocols associated with that? You know, what is the definition of the data, you know, that flows on the chain and so forth? And what I've seen actually is in case after case where people say, hey, we can, so I'm in the financial services industry, people say we can blow up SWIFT, right? So all the banks basically exchange money over SWIFT, or we can blow up Euroclear, or we can blow up any of these central things and replace them with a blockchain. And then you ask the question, okay, how do you actually define the workflows and manage that? And by the way, it's not a one-time, one-and-done kind of a thing. It's an ongoing, iterative kind of a thing as capital markets evolve and so forth. And how do you define the workflow and the standards and the protocols and so forth? And inevitably what happens is people say, well, we'll put some governance around that, right? So we create a consortium or we create a cooperative of some kind. And then you look at it and you say, well, actually, SWIFT is a cooperative, right? Euroclear is a cooperative. DTCC is, you know, a consortium, right? So, and once you get to that point, you say, okay, if you have an organization that you have entrusted with the responsibility to define or to mediate among multiple people to define those workflows and protocols and standards, then why would you not also give them the responsibility for actually running the technology? And once you've done that, then that obviates the need for blockchain, because there's actually a lot of technology that runs in a physically highly distributed kind of a way with millions of devices. I mean, you could look at the energy industry, you could look at the telecommunications industry, right? There's lots of things like that that run massively distributed. They happen to have ultimately a single administrator who is responsible for them, usually with some kind of a federated structure for scalability. And once you do that, to me, that's a, you know, established technology.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point.
Okay.
I mean, you know,
It's centralised.
I'll get into that.
They all have a point where the data can be compromised, and every database.
Not necessarily.
Now, I sound big.
You can run physically distributed, right, and not have a single physical repository of data.
I think.
I don't want to keep going on about the energy market, but I mean, so you're telling me the energy market runs perfectly for everybody, do you?
No.
On the planet. I mean, so that infrastructure works-ish, but it's using imperfect information to make really bad decisions. And so, yeah, I mean, you've just kind of put a governance kind of technology argument around an existing technology that isn't going to survive, I don't know, for the next 3 or 4 years, let alone the next 10, 15 years. I just think, the system I was talking about from the ground up is going to make better decisions for people.
Yeah, I mean, we're approaching this in grimly conservative ways, right?
right.
The internet is mainly used as a paper simulator, right? Amazon is basically catalog shopping, right? Email is basically just mail. The real structural transformations that were promised from the internet didn't really kick in until open source software, Wikipedia, and then social media. Those were the things which couldn't have existed in any form at all pre-internet. And when they kicked in, you got this new mode of economic production, which Yochai Benkler talks about as commons-based peer production. The ability to put enormous numbers of people together to make useful artifacts like Linux. And the open source software pool was worth on the order of $250 billion. You know, it's a very, very substantial body of software, runs most of the mobile phones, you know, and that artifact could only come out of the network layer, right? So to me, the real impact of blockchain is not the ability to streamline existing systems, right? There's no point in polishing the existing banking system. It's a turd, right? You don't have any way of attaching environmental impact to money. You don't have any way of tracking goods and figuring out whether slave labor was involved in the manufacturing of them. What we have is systems like the modern banking system.
You actually do.
It's certainly not down to the product level, right? Theoretically, we do. Practically speaking, by the time you get to a barcode in a shop, all of the relevant information about where that thing comes from has been kept as far from the consumers as materially possible, right? And when you start looking at things like fish markets, the question of how many people were thrown overboard to get this tuna onto a boat, nobody's interested in having that question answered in an authentic way, right? Does my phone contain conflict minerals or not? Everybody on that supply chain is incentivized to throw away that data. And it's not until you can make people do what they don't want to do, you've got a new form of power in the system. So from my perspective, we have to enforce vastly higher standards of transparency and accountability than the existing financial infrastructure permits.
So who's we, right? So here's what I wrestle with, right? So first let me go back to your examples of some of the things that weren't possible without the internet, which I absolutely, agree.
Sure.
And when you look at the early days of the internet, right, and I'm dating myself, I started using the internet in 1980. So when you look at the early days of the internet, there was a lot of hope and expectation for disintermediation. Right? The internet allows people to communicate directly with each other.
And note, by the way, that I haven't talked about disintermediation at all, right? What I've talked about is accountability and transparency, which are a very different thing from disintermediation.
Yeah. Agreed. But if I look at some of the things like Amazon, right, which is shopping, right, one of the original visions of the internet was that you wouldn't need to have intermediaries to provide those kind of services.
Sure.
People could buy and sell goods directly with each other.
Which
And
they
if
do,
you look
for
at the
example,
examples
on
you
eBay,
gave, right,
at a
Amazon
huge
dominates
scale.
online shopping,
Well,
Facebook dominates online social media.
But you've got to think about this more carefully, right? Because, for example, Amazon, although it's an intermediary, is not an opinionated intermediary, right? These things, to some degree, are neutral platforms. And that's a very different thing than when the intermediaries are opinionated and shape the markets that they're ruling over, right? So things like net neutrality, yes, you've got lots of intermediaries in the communication that carry your email, but it's still going to go point-to-point clean without the intermediary having the ability to compete with you, right? And the markets which are the least healthy are the markets where the intermediaries are trading against the people who are at the ends of the platform. And you see that's a lot in financial services, right? Brokerages that trade against their customers are endemic, right? So, I think that you need a deeper level of analysis to really get this thing by the horns, because what I'm not suggesting is that the existing systems are fit for purpose, right? If you're suggesting that the blockchain doesn't change what's happening with the existing systems, that'd be fine if the existing systems were fit for purpose. But it's a matter of survival that we change the existing systems. Right? If we don't find a way of doing global carbon accounting in a way that forces behavioral change, we are royally screwed. So I don't care about the existing systems.
Here's where I have
unless you can tell me how the existing system is going to solve the real problems, I don't care about the existing systems. You have to demonstrate to me how we modify the financial system to do carbon accounting in a way that's more credible than the blockchain solution to get this thing to hold together. Otherwise, it's just irrelevant.
So let's talk about that for a little bit more, because I want to move this on to what is stopping us from getting to mainstream. And it seems to me we're talking an awful lot about power here, because obviously you mentioned trillions of dollars there. I mean, the old phrase is follow the money, right? If we're coming in with something brand new that is going to intrinsically replace what we have, because we have decided that the existing systems are not fit for purpose, we need to come in with something new. There are a lot of people out there with an awful lot of money who do not want that to happen. How are we going to stop people in power from actually usurping everything we're trying to do with blockchain and stopping it from ever going mainstream?
Can I add one more question to that?
Sure.
And if you do that by forcing people to comply with something, who's the we doing the forcing, and how do you prevent them from becoming the bad guy in the future?
So now we're in a great question, right? So to me, the decentralization rhetoric has never made any sense to me at all, right? At the end of the day, the political promises of decentralization is basically just classical anarchism. We've seen it tried, and it rapidly collapses into hierarchical structures. So I was never interested in the decentralization argument per se. What I was interested in was accountability, transparency, and fairness, because you had a single shared history which could be used to assign responsibility for actions, right? So I was much more interested in the ledger than the decentralized aspect of the ledger. The current position that we're in right now is that we have a global governance disaster of the worst possible kind. The UN is the only clearinghouse that we really have for making anything that resembles global law, and it's completely fangless. The prospect that you could begin to build real global governance structures on a relatively informal basis and then over time formalize them, to me looks like a realistic shot, right? And that model, I think, is probably best summarized by the work that David Chom has been doing on building sortition-based global democracies. So you basically just randomly select 60,000 people, you call them up, you see what they think about a topic, you throw that through some statistical models, and it gives you a reasonably good fit for global public opinion. If you want a better fit, you put in more money. Now, those systems are affordable to build, they're technologically feasible. If Chom got his game together and ICO'd that thing tomorrow morning, for the kinds of money that you can raise at ICO, you could build a statistically significant global government. Whether anybody would follow the rules that it proposed or not is another question, but you could certainly make a very credible argument it was backed by global public opinion. Things on that level of radicalism are required, and if the answer is you can't get there from here, as a species we fail. And that's all there is. right? We either build systems that are fit for purpose in steering a kind of 8.5 billion person planet down a very, very, very narrow razor's edge, or we fail. Right? It's not that we've got the option of status quo or radical change. Anything which argues for the status quo because it's the status quo simply argues for the rape and pillage of the remaining planetary resources, followed by a hard crash of our ability to grow food. And anybody that's arguing for that is on the wrong side of history, and the question is, how do we depose them? Right? So I look at the blockchain as having the potential to begin to stand up the necessary global governance structures to be able to force accountability for carbon, to be able to force accountability for conflict minerals, to be able to force accountability for slavery. And that does not necessarily have to be constituted inside of systems like the UN. Right? You can imagine a consortium of a couple of dozen Fortune 1000 companies standing up a record-keeping system so they can prove they're not involved in, for example, slavery. And it doesn't have to be done through the existing structures. We saw SWIFT stood up from nothing. We saw Visa stood up from nothing. The UN itself was stood up from basically nothing. We can build new global structures. And if we do that, the question then is, well, where are we going to put the headquarters? Where are we going to centralize the fundamental authority? And this is where decentralization becomes useful. The best use for decentralization technology is to manage the peering arrangements between sovereign or near sovereign authorities. So if you're going to have IBM, Microsoft, or Facebook doing a deal together, and they need a shared ledger of where the records are to show that they kept the deal, that's a good instance for putting decentralization. And I think that's true for relationships between sovereign authorities and mixed bag political arrangements where you've got some sovereign authorities, some of the Fortune 1000, and some independent actors like auditors. And we can build new governance structures of this type. It's as hard as building Visa was, but it's not harder than building Visa. That was 60 years ago. So something that looks like Visa that manages climate change and slavery is the sort of thing that I think the blockchain enables. And to get to those potentials, we just have to push much harder and not get sucked into the rhetoric that blockchain is a way of doing more efficient banking. We don't need more efficient banking. It doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things. We're wasting our time if that's what we're building. We need to be building global governance that will allow us to survive as a species.
But I think, to your point there, so Bitcoin was the first application. It's aligning the social and economic incentives of a network. You opt in or you opt out. You don't have to be in Bitcoin, but if you're in that network, the mechanical enforcement of the rules make you abide by the rules. If you don't want to be in it, don't be in it. And financial markets is the worst because the role, relevance and revenue will be targeted. And of course, the vested interest in how we work in financial markets is the worst because there's a big vested interest. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for blockchain is breaking the vested interest, but can it be done? Of course. Banks will come.
We're actually seeing that, right? We're seeing banks have conversations behind the scenes about should they have their own bank coins, for example? Should you have, a Barclays pound, for example, rather than an actual British pound? Should you have like a Trump coin? Of course, if you had a Trump coin, it would be worth $1, but they would shout at you very, very loudly until they convince you it's worth $5.
You'd have to figure out which was a fake one as well.
Right, exactly. Because there's an awful lot of transaction charges behind the scenes, of course, that go on when people change currencies, and they're going to lose all of that potentially. So again, we're talking back following the money again, right?
Systems makes a lot of money for people, and when you disintermediate markets, it's anything. You take out the friction, you take out people's livelihoods, and that's a human element of this as well. Does it mean that we can't make things more efficient? Because no. So, and I think we can have strong governance around these networks because it's the only time in my experience that a blockchain works is when you have competitors that are sometimes collaborators in a network. Yeah. To me, that is the only time. People come to me all the time. It's like, why do you want a blockchain? Because it's a hype word. And I say, do you want that pink, yellow or green? And they sort of go, but it's true. It's like you probably just need a better encrypted database. You've got to really think about why you want a blockchain.
So that cooperation between competitors thing, D. Hock, the guy that invented Visa, called this chaotic governance. And his model was that in the future you could take the Visa model, which he described as being chaotic. The banks had to cooperate to create Visa, but they were also competitors. And you could scale chaotic governance across all of the other areas where we need cooperation between competitors to build efficient systems. And he was looking very directly at management of natural resources. They set up a fisheries management system along those lines, cooperation between competitors in Canada or maybe Boston, very, very successfully. And I think you've put your finger right on it, that we need technologies that enable collaboration between competitors, and we're not short of places where we could use that.
And bringing it down even further to an operational level as well, I think there's something around that cooperation between competitors. In the Energy Web Foundation, which is not, this isn't a party political broadcast on behalf of the Energy Web Foundation, by the way, but actually what you've got at the moment in
You get one more mention of it.
Yeah, I could call it EWF. So what you've got in this particular market is people quite rightly seeing particular use cases and going for it, and they're building the application layer and they're building their own blockchain layer. And they started to realise, hang on a sec, if we really want to make a difference on a global scale, we need common protocols and common platform. So they've joined a consortium or a foundation which is not for profit and have gone, look, let's get that blockchain layer sorted out together with the right kind of protocols and governance, and then let's all compete on the application layer. The second thing I'd like to say is if we get past is the technology a useful technology or not, it's that we as a community have to start behaving ourselves a little bit, I think, because there's something about confidence. And whenever they hear people racking on about whether Bitcoin's better than Bitcoin Hash, is better than Ethereum, is better than all these other cryptocurrencies at the currency level, and you've got Bitcoin versus Ethereum versus all other platforms, and then they see in the Telegraph, when they read about something around distributed ledger, they go, it's under crime because everybody's there. Until we start behaving ourselves and just kind of giving people the confidence that this stuff makes sense, and people can use it with confidence at that level, I know, which is a bit of a level down to the whole global thing, then adoption will be a problem.
I think it's an interesting idea, but at what point do we have to start behaving ourselves versus having somebody telling us how to behave? And let me give you an example of that. You might remember a small website called YouTube. And when YouTube started out, they basically let anyone upload anything at any time, and nobody cared. And then all of a sudden, some videos started to get uploaded that were not necessarily savory. And so then we had rules come into play. And it was YouTube who set the rules, eventually Google. And they basically said, let's not have this, 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 and this. And over time, that regulation forced people to only upload the right things to YouTube. We seem to be in that phase with pretty much everything that's going on in blockchain right now, where everyone's doing everything. There's a scam every day. At what point is it us behaving ourselves and not scamming the system versus somebody saying, here is how to act properly, and if we see you not acting properly, we're going to take it down?
Yeah, well, I think self-regulation in this industry, to a point, has been very good. So when I first looked at writing the self-regulation Bitcoin, it was because I tried to buy Bitcoin. It was like, oh, good God, these exchanges. It was like a dog's breakfast. So most people will do the right thing. I really believe that we as society, 85%, 90% people actually do the right thing. But the 10% you've got to worry about. But the problem with self-regulation is that it's not law. So I think we've got to the point in the ecosystem, and that's obviously why I've been working quite closely with regulators and governments, because we need to have regulations that are law and they're enforced to stop the people that are ruining it for everyone else. So consumer protection, to me, in ICOs is a big problem. If people are scamming for the 80% of the ICOs which are good, or that they're actually trying to do the right thing, for the 20% that scam you, that's wrong. So if we have laws that bring standards into this and you set them high. So in Bermuda, if you do an ICO and it's nefarious, if the source of funds isn't traceable, you go to jail for 10 years and it's a $10 million fine. And the ecosystem said, oh, Loretta, that's really hard. And I was like, well, it's not, because if you set the standard high, people didn't do the wrong thing won't come in. So if we start, and I think the internet, the fragmentation of laws around the internet and regulation taught us anything. The walled garden approach to anything doesn't work. So if we can work as a collaborative bunch, whether that be regulators, governments and industry, we're going to get a lot further.
That's very bad news for the creators of Nefarious Coin. But,
I would just add to that. I think, look, there's certainly a thing as too much regulation. I think all of us would agree we don't want to have too much regulation. I think an instructive example, you reference, I forget if it was Visa or MasterCard, right? But in the credit card industry in the United States, they didn't have any requirements basically imposed on the credit card companies to protect consumers.
Yeah.
And the US federal government sometime in the 1970s passed a law that was fought tooth and nail by all the credit card companies that basically required them to make good on, if your card was compromised and somebody used it fraudulently, made the credit card company actually have to stand behind that. So you as a consumer didn't have to worry about it. And the credit card company said, we're going to lose a ton of money this way, it's going to be terrible. Well, what happened after that actually is that the credit card business skyrocketed and they made tons of money. And the reason was because as consumers, people said, oh, I can carry this thing and I can use it and I don't have to worry about somebody compromising it and then I'm on the hook for it. So it took that away, and what you saw was going back to the original question, right? You saw massive widespread adoption. So, and right now I think, with crypto and with blockchain, more with crypto, there's a downside risk and there's certainly upside opportunity. You take away some of that downside risk and you draw a lot more people, a lot wider base of people in.
There's a funny side effect to the credit card thing. So the credit card companies, basically upped their fees to the point where they could cover the kind of 1% fraud rate. And that 1% fraud rate on credit card transactions basically pays for the entire global cybercrime industry. Because instead of the credit card companies saying, well, we need to continuously tighten security, they just jacked the fees to the point where they could soak the damage. And I think this is a generic problem that, if we set up these systems where you've got something which is big enough that it can jack fees to soak the damage, you wind up with these very highly evolved kind of parasites or hyper-parasites in the markets. Whereas if they had been forced to go to external insurers, the external insurers would have hit them so hard in the wallet that they would have actually gotten the deal right. If it was a necessary thing that you had to buy an insurance policy to go with your credit card, the same way you have to buy car insurance, we probably wouldn't have a global cybercrime industry at anything like this scale, because the insurers would have forced the systems to be secure. And they do this for underwriters' laboratories, right? That kite mark you see on all your electronic goods was a system implemented by an external regulator formed by the insurance companies because people were buying white goods that burned their houses down. So that even within the systems that we think of as being solid and reliable, the side effects from just slightly misaligning the incentives in these global systems are either huge amounts of cybercrime or electronic goods just don't catch fire. They're incredibly reliable from a house safety perspective because the insurers have the right set of incentives to make sure the damn things are tight. And I think that this is, to me, the big challenge with this kind of next 5, 10, 15-year cycle of building these global structures, is that if we slightly misalign the incentives as we begin to build out these global machines, we're going to wind up with horrific problems. Like Wikipedia, right, started as a thing that was not worth anybody's time to modify for political reasons, and now dozens of the top 100 editors are basically political fronts for folks like the Israelis. And the system was never designed to stand up to that kind of concerted political pressure. So we have to think about how we're going to handle, the power that we will accumulate as we go and build these systems. Because if there are even slight misalignments, it's so much harder to upgrade these systems once they're running than it is to get it right the first time out.
So let's flip this around slightly. As we get into our last few minutes of the panel. As the room reaches Palm Springs-like temperatures. So, one of the things that I keep hearing here is, we're going to need to make some serious cultural changes in terms of what we do as consumers, in order for blockchain technology to become completely mainstream. And this is not, unnormal. This is standard marketplace stuff. So. When you look at anything that changes things culturally, it always takes a generation to bed in, sometimes 2 generations, depending upon the technology. The United States credit card business, for example, they still haven't rolled out chip and pin across the entire country. You can maybe get it in a Target and a Walgreens and a CVS, but you can't get it in a shop in the Rust Belt. And still every day people swipe their cards, they get cloned, and then you end up with $2,000 worth of Target gift cards purchased on your details. That happens every single day over there. We've been using it here for 15, 20 years. So, cultural change takes a long time to bed in, especially in large populations. What are your best ideas? I'll run down the line here. You've got a minute or 2 each. What are your best ideas in terms of how we're going to accelerate mainstream adoption of blockchain technology and or cryptocurrencies without going through that big cultural change generational cycle, even for skeptics?
Even for skeptics. So partly I think it is a generational cycle. Partly I think it's taken a different approach to it, and it's we need to move it from being a technology that hackers can use, right, to a technology that mainstream businesses and mainstream consumers can use. So that might require some regulation, but I think it's frankly, as an industry, people need to grow up and recognize that you're not just addressing your friends and your fellow technologists. You've got to address a much broader market.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's consumer protection is one of the biggest obstacles for governments. And I think if you looked at how cryptocurrency is now traded by the CME, you're seeing it becoming quite mainstream, that people are actually looking, and it's not currency, by the way. I'm quite vocal that we're talking about a barter system of commodities. So digital assets, I think, are another asset class. And I think the way that it's now coming into the venture capital guys and the bankers like us who didn't really believe in it 3 years ago are starting to trade these things. I think and they're starting to be regulated by governments around the world that I look at. I think you're starting to see a bit of credibility come into it, and I think that'll only get better. So if you have regulation, it comes credibility, not over-regulation, but I think by the fact that people are looking to regulate it and they're actually starting to have the conversations in governments and central banks, then we're moving in the right direction.
What she said. But also, if I come at it from a slightly different kind of viewpoint as well, and look at it from, if you like, the B2B piece, so it's not just about, the consumer and also the people that they buy services from, and have a lot of companies who are vested in the current business models surviving for as long as they possibly can. And I think from a technology adoption piece, then I think we may need to go through a little bit of an intranet versus internet time. And I'm old enough to remember that, so, they were both so, giving. And that's where I talk about behaving ourselves, because, when I came out of the corporate world and started talking to people from the open public blockchain side, they're going, "You're the devil, you're just trying to control this thing because you're private permissioned, etc." And I'm kind of going, well, no, actually, I completely believe, I'm completely on the same page as Vinay and Loretta about the need to change global business models for the sake of humanity. But I'm also about the fact that it may take incumbents to be able to use the technology in a way that they get confidence in the basic use cases, and that ultimately it will collapse into the open public infrastructure. But there may well be a kind of a internet moment that we may go through with this private mission. We just need to kind of respect that, and as a community go, well, look, this is pretty good doing it that way. So that's my view.
So my take on this is that basically B2C in first world countries is completely served, right? Credit cards on existing e-commerce platforms, we're not going to get much better than that. So the big underserved areas are all the transactions, including things like identity in poor countries, which is about 2/3 of the planet, but only about 10 or 20% of the cash. So there could be a couple of very large-scale things that would happen, and I think M-Pesa kind of points the way at something along those kind of lines. Yeah. Lots of opportunity there, and this is the classic kind of leapfrogging development model. The other market is B2B. I mean, B2C e-commerce is on the order of $1 trillion a year of transactions. That gives you something like 5 of the world's top 10 biggest companies, because the internet is a fantastic tool for concentrating wealth. But the B2B markets are still largely run by people emailing each other PDF files and Excel spreadsheets. Yeah. We haven't really seen the breakthrough of e-commerce into B2B in any kind of systemic way. And that market is on the order of 50 times larger than the B2C market. So I think if you get a decent electronic representation of a 90-day invoice with a set of terms attached to it, which is very achievable with today's smart contract technology, then you could see large-scale transformations of the B2B markets, particularly in the things where you've got interlocking contracts and supply chains. Energy is a good example of something that works that way as well. And that sort of stuff, containerization basically was 7% of global GDP, something like that. I think fixing the paperwork on B2B transactions is probably 5 to 10% of global GDP, because you get rid of huge amounts of reconciling and accounting and all the rest of this kind of stuff. So I think there are enormous plays to be made there. And then the other thing is globalization in the industrial model is seriously hiccuping. So Trans-Pacific Partnership was cancelled, so that's not going to happen. NAFTA is in trouble, the EU is in trouble. And this kind of golden age of industrial globalization was basically you passed the same laws at either end of the transaction, then you put the goods in a big metal box, shipped them across, opened them, and they were under the same regulatory framework. This was the kind of EU model. It's not really going to work in a tripolar world, right? The Americans, the Chinese, and the EU are not going to harmonize regulations. Even the continental trade blocs are beginning to fray pretty badly. So I think the possibility is that you get a kind of globalization 2.0, which we've done a bit of writing about, where you use computer systems to implement the local regulation, and you simulate trade until it gets through the simulator, and then you stick a barcode on the front of your box and you ship it. And those kind of models where you use computers to basically remove the non-tariff barriers to trade globally kind of give you this model which solves the trilemma of globalization, right? It gives you something where you do actually get full local autonomy, and as long as there's a nice machine-readable description of what your jurisdiction wants, and you've got integrated kind of fourth wave manufacturing on the other side of it, you can sort of just about see a mechanism where your computer reads the legal spec from the other end of the transaction system, figures out how the product has to be labeled, manufactures it to that spec, and then ships it, more or less without a human in the loop. And that's not even a really heavy AI problem. That's really just a case of diligently writing down what's supposed to happen in a form that a machine can work with. Is this product labeled in grams or ounces? That doesn't necessarily need a heavy AI to solve. So I think those kind of models where it's B2B, trade facilitation, management of a lot of the space left by the problems we're hitting with international trade as it currently stands, supply chain tracking to enable business with the developing world without the presumption that there's kind of wrongdoing on the far end of the supply chain. All of those things, I really think it might just be a sequence of technologies that finally bring e-commerce meaningfully to the B2B sector. I'm not really sure that consumer stuff is going to move that far at all, because the consumers are already more or less perfectly served, aren't they?
Fantastic. That's a wonderful footnote to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, please give your warm appreciation to our wonderful experts.